astronauts are people who willingly put themselves in harm's way in order to advance the human species. Their work requires courage and dedication and skill, and it's generally considered to be selfless work. You don't become an astronaut for your own aggrandizement. You do it for your nation or for the whole species. And thus the disappointment in the summer of 1972 when a scandal broke out over the behavior of some of NASA's astronauts. The Apollo 15 postal cover scandal seems little remembered today, but it rocked the nation at the time, and it destroyed the careers of men who had been hailed as national heroes. It isn't easy to go to the moon. The website of the Planetary Society estimates that the total cost of the Apollo program alone at $257 billion in 2020 adjusted dollars. As only 12 people have walked on the moon, that makes an adjusted cost of around $21 billion per person. Given the average weight of the lunar module, that figures out to roughly $1.2 million per pound carried to the moon. That is a lot of taxpayer dollars, and it says something about a peculiar perk of spaceflight. While astronauts were paid reasonable salaries, Apollo 11 mission commander Neil Armstrong's annual salary was roughly $200,000 in adjusted dollars. Each of the 12 who landed on the moon were allowed to carry roughly half a pound of personal items, which with simple math accounted for roughly $600,000 in transportation cost. In addition to the 2 half-pound kits carried by the astronauts in the lunar module, larger personal preference kits, or PPKs, up to 5 pounds each, were allowed all 3 mission astronauts to be carried on the mission, but not to the moon in the larger command module. You can certainly quibble with these numbers. The Apollo program would likely have cost the same without the so-called personal preference kits, but it's hard to deny that carrying a half pound of personal items to the moon and back is a perk that few can claim. NASA began allowing personal preference kits with the Gemini program. The purpose of the PPK was, NASA policy explained, for the astronauts' personal use or for use by them as personal gifts. The idea was to carry small items of limited monetary value, which would gain significance for having been to space. For the Gemini program, all personal items had to fit into a 6 by 7 inch nylon drawstring bag, although the size of the bag was changed to 8 by 4 by 2 inches for the Apollo program. The contents were not announced by NASA, but the astronauts were allowed to say what was in the bag at their own discretion. On Gemini 6A in 1965, astronaut Wally Schirra's PPK carried Navy wings, a 33-degree Masonic ring, a 1950 D coin, a dime-sized memento, 5 C-sized mementos, a miniature Gemini spacecraft, a Florida hunting license, 20 gold medals, 5 silver medals, various flags, and 15 mission patches. Astronauts had to develop their lists, which had to be approved by the Director of Crew Flight Operations, who was responsible for ensuring that the items fit in the bag and were within weight limitations. Moreover, the policy was that items are not to be used for or given for any commercial or fundraising purposes. Prohibited items with the PPK, the policy stated, are those that might create subsequent problems with respect to flight safety, commercialism, personal aggrandizement or gain, derogatory character, and good taste. Outside of the PPK, the policy stipulated, all other personal items are prohibited. Yet astronauts did not always follow the rules. In March 1965, astronauts Gus Grissom and John Young smuggled a corned beef sandwich onto Gemini 3. They lunched on the sandwich, and it seemed a fine, funny thing, the United Press International reported, but the dangerous breach of discipline prompted a congressional investigation, and NASA admitted that there was a risk that breadcrumbs could interfere with the operation of the onboard flight equipment. NASA promised Congress that they would tighten policy, and Grissom and Young were reprimanded. Grissom wrote that, after the flight, our superiors at NASA let us know in no uncertain terms that non-man-rated corned beef sandwiches were out for future space missions. Astronauts broke the rules again in December the same year, with astronauts Wally Schirra and Tom Stafford managing to bring a set of tinkling bells and a small 4-note harmonica on board Gemini 6A, which they used to play jingle bells after reporting sighting an unidentified flying object that was apparently Santa Claus. But the prank went without discipline, with the UPI quoting a space agency official that I'm sure it was not a case of smuggling. Then came Apollo 15. The fourth Apollo mission in 1971 had ambitious goals. It was the first of 3 extended missions with an upgraded capsule capable of a 75-hour stay. Having already served as the backup crew for Apollo 12, Mission Commander David Scott, Lunar Module Pilot James Irwin, and Command Module Pilot Alfred Worden had time for more science training, and the mission was to dedicate more time to sample collection. Scott and Irwin would have a far greater ability to conduct these experiments, as Apollo 15 would be the first to include the motorized Lunar Roving Vehicle, or moon buggy. The mission went spectacularly, a rousing success that not only set several records, but reinvigorated public interest in the space program. But a NASA release in September of 1972 put a stain on an otherwise nearly flawless mission. Since the mission, a number of questions have been raised concerning the propriety of the crew's conduct, especially in relation to the disposition of personal souvenirs and mementos. That is, Apollo 15 became a scandal because of PPK. The scandal broke in June. The Chicago Sun-Times reported on June 26th. 100 envelopes taken to the moon by the crew of Apollo 15 were later sold by a German stamp dealer for more than $150,000. At the time, NASA spokesman Jack Riley told the Times that the crew had not profited and will not profit from the sale. The dealer, Herman Siegler, for his part, had refused to say where he got the letters, or even if he paid for them. The matter was under investigation, but the letters had been signed by all three astronauts, and their signatures had been notarized by a NASA employee. Their participation, though, was later confirmed. The New York Times reported on July 16th. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration announced that a 3-week investigation had disclosed that a West German stamp dealer, Herman A. Seeger, had parlayed last year's Apollo 15 moon landing into a $150,350 profit, and he had done so with the aid of the Apollo 15 astronauts. As the scandal made the newspapers and shocked the public, all three astronauts, as well as several NASA administrators, were called into a 5-hour closed-door meeting with a Senate investigative committee. The items at issue were called postal covers, or printed envelopes. Such covers were commonly taken. In fact, an envelope with a special cancellation stamp had been sent by the United States Post Office for cancellation on the moon. A total of 243 postal covers had been authorized, many special envelopes that the astronauts had within policy given as souvenirs to friends and NASA employees. In addition, 144 had been carried by Worden in his PPK. These had had their stamps canceled aboard the recovery ship USS Okinawa and were signed by all three astronauts. While authorized, these covers represented an issue. They had been designed by F. Herrick, a friend of Worden's who was a stamp collector. Worden had given 40 to Herrick and asked him to hold on to 60 more for safekeeping, but Herrick quickly sold 3 and sent others to Europe for sale. This quick sale so soon after the mission garnered public attention. Just as concerning, the investigation found that Herrick had advised the Apollo 15 crew to carry first-day covers and to then store them safely for some years, during which they would become valuable collector items. This came dangerously close to the prohibition against using PPK items for commercial or fundraising purchase, although the 1972 NASA statement noted. To date, no information has been developed indicating that there were agreements or arrangements between Herrick and Worden whereby Worden was to have received anything of value from any sale of the covers by Herrick. But there was a larger concern. The report noted that 398 other covers, part of a large order of cached covers paid for by a privately employed public relations man with a wide circle of friends among the NASA astronauts, had been carried aboard in the pocket of David Scott's spacesuit without authorization. Moreover, the investigation determined that the public relations man, H. Walter Eiermann, had been contacted by a European stamp dealer named Herman Siegler, who had concluded that special stamped envelopes carried on a lunar mission would have significant commercial value. The report explained that Eiermann proposed to Scott and later to Worden and Irwin that the astronauts carry 100 special covers to the moon for him, and in return, Eiermann offered a monetary consideration, approximately $7,000 apiece. The 3 astronauts had additionally decided to bring 200 more, although NASA concluded that the total number was altogether 398, for their own use. In anticipation of the deal, the report found that Eiermann opened a $7,000 savings account in a German bank for each of the astronauts with their consent. The damning conclusion, according to the report, was that there was apparent intent of the Apollo 15 crew to gain personally from the exercise of their astronaut privileges. It was a terrible embarrassment, what NASA called poor judgment. The New York Times harkened back to one of the worst scandals in baseball, writing, "The only thing missing was a small, tearful, dirty-faced boy in the hall crying, 'Say it ain't so, Dave! say it ain't so. But the situation wasn't completely simple. While the covers were not listed as Bing and Scott's preference kit, the investigation noted, had they been so listed, they would probably have been routinely approved for inclusion in a preference kit, as had the 243 authorized covers noted above. The investigation also found that it is the contention of the astronauts that there was to be no commercialization or advertising of these covers, and that nothing would be done with them until after completion of the Apollo program, and that when the public sale in Germany came to the attention of the astronauts, Scott telephoned Eiermann to request that sales be stopped and the covers returned. Moreover, in February of 1972, the astronauts decided not to accept the $7,000 in the German bank accounts, and Scott took steps to assure that the funds were returned to Eiermann. The astronauts further rejected an offer by Eiermann to provide them with a commemorative stamp album in lieu of the payments. But in the course of the investigation, they discovered two other irregularities. NASA reported that the Apollo 15 crew had desired to make a personal, private, symbolic gesture commemorating all deceased astronauts and cosmonauts. This was a memorial placed on the moon with a plaque and a small, custom-made sculpture called the Fallen Astronaut. The 2018 edition of Slate magazine writes that at 12:18 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time on August 2, 1971, Commander David Scott of Apollo 15 placed a 3.5-inch tall aluminum sculpture onto the dusty surface of a small crater near his parked lunar rover. At that moment, the moon transformed from an airless ball of rock into the largest exhibition space in the known universe. Scott regarded the moment as a tribute to the heroic astronauts and cosmonauts who had given their lives in the space race. The statue memorial had been approved, but there turned out to be a problem. NASA writes that the crew's clear understanding with Belgian sculptor Paul van Hooijdonk was that there was to be no commercial or personal exploitation of this memorial. Hooijdonk, on the other hand, did not share that understanding. Slate writes that van Hooijdonk was thrilled that his art was pointing a way to a human destiny beyond Earth and expected that he would soon be bigger than Picasso. In May of 1972, Scott found out that 950 replicas of the fallen astronaut figurine signed by the sculptor had been advertised for sale by the Waddell Gallery of New York at a price of $750 apiece. Under pressure from NASA, van Hooijdonk pulled the sculptures off the market. Additionally, it was determined that Scott had taken on board two unauthorized timepieces, a wristwatch and a stopwatch. Scott had agreed to evaluate these timepieces for the manufacturer at the request of a friend, and thinking they might be useful, particularly for the possible emergency timing of a manually controlled propulsion maneuver, Scott carried them on the mission, but without prior authorization. As with the covers and the sculpture, the appearance of benefiting from his position was the problem. NASA, the report says, has deliberately withheld the name of the manufacturer of the timepieces to avoid commercialization of this unauthorized action. The investigation resulted in a significant penalty. Considering as well their ultimate rejection of such personal gain, Scott, Worden, and Irwin had been formally reprimanded. Their official efficiency reports as military officers reflect a formal finding of lack of judgment. These two actions result in severe career penalties, whether the astronauts remain in the federal service or not. Although the agency told the New York Times astronauts are under a period of extreme stress in the months preceding a flight to the moon. The Times wrote that the penalties were the most severe ever meted out. Owing to the penalty, the three were unlikely to ever get another flight assignment. Irwin retired. Scott and Worden were transferred out of the astronaut program to other NASA positions. But was the severity of the penalty fair? Scott said in an interview in Smithsonian Magazine in 2011, there had been a similar incident the previous year when the Apollo 14 crew allegedly made a deal with Franklin Mint to bring silver medallions into space, but NASA kind of smoothed that over because the astronaut involved was Alan Shepard, the first American in space, who was a little more famous than we were. But he said those postal covers were sold a couple of months after the flight and quickly became public knowledge. So I think NASA management felt they had to do something. And it was not quite as simple as it seems. While the items were specifically intended to be of low monetary value and not used for commercial purposes, that's a fine line. Astronauts were not supposed to profit from their position, but of course, many have since made money from writing memoirs or signing autographs or giving speeches. And PPK items have turned profits. Buzz Aldrin's signed PPK bag from Apollo 11, just the bag, not the items inside, sold at auction in 2015 for $50,000. Neil Armstrong bought a few significant bits of aviation history in his PPK on Apollo 11. The biographer later wrote, "He is most clear about and most proud of the pieces of the historic Wright Flyer that he took to the moon. Under a special arrangement with the U.S. Air Force Museum in Dayton, he took in his lunar module PPK a piece of wood from the Wright brothers' 1903 airplane's left propeller and a piece of muslin fabric 8 by 13 inches from its upper left wing. The items remained with Armstrong and were not used for personal gain or commercialization, but Armstrong passed in 2012, and in 2018, many of the items in his personal collection were sold at auction. A 1 1/4 inch square of fabric from the Wright Flyer that had been taken to the moon sold for $96,875. Overall, the pieces of his memorabilia sold for over $14.5 million. Proceeds went to his 2 sons, who told the Cincinnati Enquirer that some of the proceeds would be used to build a charitable organization called Vantage Earth Foundation. Further investigations found out that 15 other NASA astronauts had violated standing policy by making deals for the sale of postal covers that had been taken on NASA missions. There were various suspensions and reprimands, although most of them were allowed to stay with the astronaut program. But one exception was Jack Swigert, the hero pilot of the command module of the ill-fated Apollo 13 mission. Initially, Swigert denied that he had anything to do with postal covers, and when it was found that he lied and had taken money, his flight career was ended. NASA changed its policy in many different ways. Astronauts still carry personal preference kits today, but among other restrictions, by federal law, they're not allowed to carry any philatelic items in them. In a bit of exoneration, in 1983, Worden sued to have the postal covers that NASA had confiscated returned. The Justice Department determined that the government had no right to contest the claim. Some of those returned cards have since been sold for as much as $15,000. In an irony, the watch that Dave Scott had worn unauthorized turned out to be very special because all other watches that were worn by the astronauts of the Apollo program on their missions, which were Omega Speedmasters, belonged to NASA. But that one watch that Scott had taken, which was a Bulova timepiece, was personal property and thus is the only watch that has been worn on the moon that could be sold. And it was at auction in 2015 for $1,625,000. While there was clearly a lapse of judgment by these astronauts, the question of whether the penalty was fair remains today. But science author Andrew Chaikin wrote in his 1995 book, A Man on the Moon, no matter what the astronauts thought of this stamp scandal, the damage had been done because the myth of the perfect astronaut had crumbled. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.